chair of Ukrainian Studies in Toronto, is one of most prominent centers in the Western world, and certainly Professor Magocsi is one of the most known historians in Ukrainian studies, especially in the western part of the world, but not only. I'm sure you have encountered his book about history of Ukrainian lands and people, but also he published much more. His breadth and depth is really impressive. So our students in Eastern and Central European Studies has used his atlases, historical atlases on East Central Europe and on Ukraine also especially, but also he published a lot on minorities in East and Central Europe, on Crimean Tatars, but also and especially on Carpathorusins. I would like to call Professor Magocsi a kind of father of Carpathorusins nation, because he contributed to writing their history and codify their language. So it's really a work which is hugely worth to admire. He also published a lot about Ukrainian and Russian diaspora question, but also about Ukrainian Jewish relations, which Natalia has mentioned. So we are very happy to have you here, and you will, we agreed that it will be not a formal lecture, but a conversation with a known journalist and historian, Peter Johnsson. Maybe you have encountered his book about Ukrainian history, but which I recommend always very warmly. It's published in Swedish, but also several books about Poland published in Swedish, and on Central Europe. And recently you published about Holocaust as well. So you are really a good partner to converse on, among others, Babyn Yar. So warmly welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. But I can only add that Professor Magocsi has already his place in the historiography of Ukraine, yeah? Because this story, that story, you can say, begins perhaps with Shwedski during the 19th century in Ukraine, yeah? But when the Soviets came, of course, it died out in Ukraine, and it moved over, especially after the war, to America, yes, to both United States and Canada, the first Ukrainian institute in Alberta in Canada, and then Toronto and Harvard, yeah. And in rest of the world, it didn't exist actually, yeah? Perhaps in Monachium, yeah, or München, yeah. And in this process, you have already your own place in the historiography, I would say. Yeah? But we will begin to talk about the book about Babyn Yar. As you know, in the Holocaust in Western world, it is connected as a symbol with Auschwitz, yes. But the Holocaust began much earlier, yeah? Even before the Wannsee conference, because in the eastern part of Europe, in Ukraine and Belarus, they murdered 1.5 million Jews, yes, who were by bullets, the Holocaust by bullets, shot down to the rabbis. One of the most well-known, or you will say known, is the massacre of the Jews in Kiev, the 29th and 30th of September in 1921. 41, exactly, of course, 41. When more than 33,000 Jews had to march out from central Kiev, and during 2 days were brutally put dead in a ravine, yes? And this book is not only about this event, yeah, but about the history up to today's day about Babyn Yar. Because during the Soviet time, it was forbidden, you can say more or less, to talk about that. The dissidents did that in Kiev, yeah? And there was no monument at this place. Not until 76, I think. But that monument, it was in the park near side, and the ravine was artificial. But then there were written that here is a monument of Soviet citizen who was killed. Yeah? And it had not until the independence of Ukraine in 91, you get the real monument out with the ravines. Yes. And the history of Babyn Yar has been in poetry, Yevchenko's poem, Shostakovich's symphony. Today we have a young poet in Hungary which is written about giving voice to the people in Babyn Yar. Yeah? But there is still not a real memorial thing out in Babyn Yar. It is discussed during the last 10 years or so, but the war has stopped this discussion. Yeah? But what is important is that in Babyn Yar it's not only Jews, but also Romas, Ukrainians, up to perhaps 100,000 people murdered. Yeah? So my first question, this is an essay book with different people writing about this history of the memoir memory. Yeah? So my first question is, why is Babyn Yar such central in this memory of Babyn Yar? Yeah? And what can we learn from this whole history up to today's day?
Well, I guess one way of looking at this is that any historical phenomenon, even if it lasts for several years, in some cases several decades, almost always has a kind of pivotal moment or a symbolic moment that people are taught to remember, because the historical moments don't make themselves. They are made by historians who create history, and then publicists who pick it up and run with it, and then by governments that often take advantage of it for their own purposes, or don't take advantage of it and prefer to forget it and to place it into the realm of oblivion.
What was the case with
and,
Babyn Yar?
and we have many cases of that in Central and Eastern Europe, and you just alluded to Babyn Yar as one of those events that was placed into oblivion. The Great Famine of 32-33 in this part of the world also. But to go back to your question of why Babyn Yar, and it becoming the symbolic moment for the Holocaust in the East, or as you rightly pointed out, the Holocaust by bullets as opposed to the Holocaust by asphyxiation. I think that there are perhaps two reasons for why Babyn Yar. The first is that the destruction was quick, brutal, and took place in an incredibly short period of time. I mean, within 2 days, you're killing close to 34,000 people. I mean, just stop and think. There are only 48 hours to do this. I mean, even if you wanted to, I never thought about this, even if you wanted to do the math and divide, let's say, 34,000 by 48 hours, right? So and even though it wasn't the largest number of Jews who were killed on the territory of Ukraine, it wasn't the largest of these murderous missions, but it was the shortest and the quickest and the most concentrated. So that's one element. And then the other element is that it took place in, for all intents and purposes, the capital administrative center or the capital of a country. well, then
a couple of days after the
takes,
Germans had entered.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly, and it takes on other kinds. This is the very fact that you're doing it right in the center of the country and in the middle of a city, not out in some small village, so forth and so on. And so I would suggest that these, to my mind, my first reaction would be the two reasons why Babyn Yar is singled out.
Mm-hmm. Also by so many, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a discussion in Germany some years ago about different mass murders all over the world and the Holocaust. Yes, a new historic is right, if we say so. And even Habermas had to write about it. Yeah. And then there was one female historian, Asman was her name. Yeah, and she said if there should be a European identity, it should be coupled to Holocaust. Yes, because this is all over Europe, not only in Auschwitz but also in Eastern Europe. Yeah. But then there is one problem, yes? Because if you go from Babyn Yar to the other side of the town, you will come to Bukovnia. If you are in East and are in Trostinets, it's also a big death camp for the Jews, yes? And go around the Ringway, you come in 10 minutes to Kuropatty. In both those times, Stalin killed 100,000 people, yeah? So how shall you get this together, yes? The one mass murder and another. So it is it possible to make a common European identity with those things, or?
Look, throughout history in the modern period and going back to the Middle Ages, Europeans have developed a high level of specialization in killing each other. Probably more effectively and more brutally than other parts of the world over a long period of time. So that is in fact one characteristic of the European continent. It's also related to kind of cultural values in which you have citizens in various parts of the country, people in various parts of the country over several centuries who are outward looking, taking initiative, trying to discover in various parts of the world, you know, all of this kind of dynamism leads to and can lead to conflict, all of which has resulted in ongoing mass destruction. But on the other hand, Europe has been an incredibly creative series of civilizations. In the arts, in scientific discovery, inventions, on and on and on. So to speak as if I understood correctly that, well, shouldn't or couldn't the Holocaust be, how did you formulate it? How did she formulate it, a kind of unifying symbol or representative of Europe?
Yeah, we all know this. You all relate it to the history, not to the Christianity or to the Greek.
Fine, okay, well, you know, all know it. Most people don't know anything about anything. One is known, one is made to know these things through various forms. Look, as you well know, right after the Holocaust took place, for the first 5 years, no one wanted to hear, beginning first and foremost with Jews, and they didn't want to hear about the Holocaust. This was an embarrassing thing, you know, and it was difficult for historians, Jewish historians of the Holocaust, to even get their books published. No one wanted to hear about this, right? Well, then it suddenly happened to take on a cachet. It became, you know, in mode, intellectually in mode. So, you know, these moments of knowledge awareness are also created, and memory is created, just like history is created by historians, memory is created by those who read these history books and make use of what they want to do to pursue a memory or to forget it. I guess, in the long story short, it would seem to me pretty unpleasant if we're going to use as a symbolic unifying factor for European civilization, you know, this dastardly series of years that are associated with the Holocaust of what is it? So it's 6 million Jews. Well, how many other millions of people were killed before that in various wars, including World War I, by the way? Yeah. Many more millions who were still living at the time, or their descendants were living at the time of the Holocaust. The whole idea of even needing to search for some kind of unifying symbol, I don't get it. I don't understand the need for it, let alone picking one that is beyond the level of negativism. So this, of course, you're asking a kind of general philosophical question, and you're getting an answer that's very personal. But after all, this is, we're reflecting philosophically here. We're not basing our opinions on some kind of concrete evidence or so forth and so on. It's just, quote unquote, a feeling, if you will.
She was, of course, making allusion to the European Union, which was built after the Second World War. Yeah?
Isn't that a nice thing to remember? Yeah. Thank you very much. After thousands of years of killing each other, until the French and Germans finally said, we had enough of this crap over Alsace and Lorraine. Who needs these dastardly, unattractive places? And we're killing ourselves over 1,000 years over them. And they finally said, that's enough. That's enough. And it was thanks to that agreement between those people that arose, for all intents and purposes, now this is a major achievement. This is what we should be remembering.
Yeah. Okay, you could add to this, yeah, that the big politicians at that time, it was Churchill and it was de Gaulle and so on, and in Germany, they said that we should forget the past, yeah, and build something new, to build something new. That was what they said, yeah.
And I, as a historian, would be the first to say, we should stop studying history. It's a hobby for those who are interested in various levels of the past, whether driven by nostalgia, or whether driven by curiosity, or driven by voyeurism. And the whole idea is that very often said, well, you have to study the past in order to avoid the mistakes of the future. Actually, people study the past and make the same mistakes over again anyway. And maybe even in a worse level. So, what's the... I don't necessarily disagree with this opinion. Who needs history?
But Churchill wrote history, although he said that forget it, yeah?
And I write histories too. And I'd like my books to be read. Yeah. And they can have some impact on people. Yeah, good. We're talking now... As I sometimes do, as a professor, in extremes for provocation, etc., etc. But there's some you have to be measured here, and so there is something to be said for, if not forgetting the past, trying to keep it in perspective. And maybe that's really what I'm saying here. Why does any particular event get more attention than others? And we know that those particular events, are superseded by some other major event. And the Holocaust, I think, it's had its run.
You think so, yeah?
Yeah.
But can you tell us what is going on in Babyn Yar in the discussions today?
Okay, well, sure. Now what's going on is not a discussion over really what happened. We have enough documentation to know the specifics, thanks to the practices of Nazi Germany in general, of recording pretty meticulously whatever they did, often filming it as well. and then maybe selectively trying to destroy it, but then they made the mistake of recording it. And so sooner or later we found this stuff. But what is going on is not a debate about what transpired during these 2 days, number one, and plus the other 2 or 3 years after that. I mean, there are particulars, but they got the story more or less down. Well, what we're witnessing today is a very strong, knockdown, drag out battle, which has only been put on hold because of the war. But that struggle and that controversy has to do very specifically with how to remember an event that certain people believe should be remembered. So we begin with the fact, okay, this is a terrible event. There's no question about it that the initiative that had been taken already in Soviet times was by the small Jewish community, some of whom were brave enough to come out in Soviet times when the Soviets were opposed to any kind of manifestation, let alone a manifestation that didn't, about a historical event that didn't fit into their narrative. And so you had the small number of Jews who kept the memory of Babyn Yar alive. And then, because under independent Ukraine, the independent Ukrainian state, encouraged by not only Jews within Ukraine, but Jews outside of Ukraine, and even Ukrainian organizations themselves within Ukraine and outside Ukraine, including the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, have decided to make this a cause, the cause of memorialization. And we know, and every one of you could probably give examples from here in Sweden or from wherever you come from, of controversy over historical memory. A, the decision to memorialize. B, how to memorialize. Who's going to be responsible for doing it? What should be stressed? What should not be stressed? And virtually every major monument has been fraught with years and years of debate and discussion. It's almost remarkable that you did get finally a monument to the Vietnam War in the United States, or that you built a replica, and it's not a replica, thank God, because it was aesthetically disastrous to begin with, the World Trade Tower centers, you know, what to replace there. And we can duplicate that in various countries, various monuments, and including in Babyn Yar. And the only difference is that the Babyn Yar debate of how to memorialize that space, which began already under Soviet times, but was remained in the realm of discussion because you couldn't do anything unless you had the full approval and support of the governmental authorities. Well, after independent Ukraine, you could do, and that debate is still going on today, with a struggle between two forces, which is discussed, by the way, in the last chapter of this book. And the two forces, to simplify matters, are forces that are basically outside the territory of Ukraine, and the other force inside the territory of Ukraine. Because one of the things as well is, fine, we can have, the only consensus is, we need some kind of memorialization. And that's probably the end of the consensus, because then we get into what kind of memorialization, and very important, who's going to pay for it? These things cost money. Even a simple, even quote unquote, just a monument costs money. Who's going to pay for this? And this then, if a particular government has not the funds or the commitment to commemorating and paying for a monument, but if that government, and I'm now really speaking about the government of independent Ukraine, is open, liberal-minded, welcome to outside assistance if it comes along, why not? And so that is what resulted in the case of Babyn Yar, and ever since the 75th anniversary commemoration, which this organization, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, initiated the first major commemoration, a week-long commemoration that began in the week of the last week in September 2016, culminating with the 28th, 29th. Only later did the government of Ukraine latch itself onto this and do their own thing as the final. But then, ever since then, again, the idea that, yes, something must be done. Everyone agrees. There's a consensus. And then, to make a long story short, you had two forces, as I said, external forces that came in with very big dollars, millions of dollars. But those forces were led by a small coterie of classic Soviet oligarchs, 3 of the 4 based in Moscow, even though they may or may not have been originally born in Ukraine. And one of those 4, the one who was funding and still is funding the largest amount of money, was in the close circle of Putin. This was a problem already after 2014, and now this is like the kiss of death. But at the same time, during that same period, the government of Ukraine, the presidential office, commissioned the Institute of Ukrainian History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences to come up with a plan of how to memorialize this space. And both of them came up with projects. And immediately it led to conflict between these two projects, in which not only citizens of Ukraine took part, in particular with regard to the project of the Institute of History, which we call the Ukrainian project. And both here, taking the lead on their commission were 3 Ukrainians of Jewish background, relatively young scholars and historians, activists. And then you had the other project, which claimed to be international and was international. Their historical advisory committee was headed by a person from the Netherlands. It's actually a former graduate student of mine. And these two were now in conflict. And then the government that had commissioned, quote unquote, the Ukrainian project is now asked by the, quote unquote, Russian project to give its imprimatur to them. Because on the other hand, you can declare to memorialize, you want to build a memorial. Well, A, you have to have money, and then, by the way, it would be nice to have permission of the people who own the land. Right? This is another issue. And in this particular case, it was the city of Kiev that owned the land. So you had to get, you had to lobby the city council of Kiev. So all of these things are done. And the presidential, that is the government of Ukraine, like many governments, tried to have it both ways. commissioned a Ukrainian project and yet allowed for the ongoing activity of quote-unquote the Russian project. And this is up until 2022. Of course, since 2022, February, everything's on hold.
I will still leave the Babyn Yar, but in this discussion with the Ukrainian project and the international project, are there also discussion and conflict about this, that Babyn Yar is not only the last location of Jewish people, but also of many, the Romas who were killed there and Ukrainians?
Absolutely. Part of this, without question, part of this discussion and the plans, concrete plans, which are online, one can read these, both projects, both of these projects, certainly the Ukrainian one, look at Babyn Yar actually as, see, without question, everyone knows, as you pointed out from the very beginning, it's not just ethnic Ukrainians, it's not just Jews, but also ethnic Ukrainians, Roma, vast numbers of Soviet prisoners of war.
And even OON.
And amongst the ethnic Ukrainians, Ukrainian nationalist activists, communists, anyone who somehow the Germans didn't like and wanted to get rid of, because after those 2 days, there were still remnants of Jewish communities in central Ukraine that didn't get deported during the rapid Soviet retreat. They were brought there, and so the Jews were liquidated, but all these other groups as well. And in the commemoration discussions, yes, it is considered that one has to look at all the elements. But then, part of the debate between the commemorative process is the emphasis. So, one of these two programs says this should be a museum should be built primarily devoted to the Holocaust and on Babyn Yar. The other one would say, well, it's not fine. It would be good to have a national museum of Ukraine, just like Poland has, on the Holocaust throughout Ukraine. Because it was not only in Kiev, where precisely, right, exactly. And then the next thing is, well, should a museum, which is both projects have the idea of a museum, should a museum just be looking at the World War II period? What about the history of Jews? Well, that's a different story. But even if we're thinking of relating to the Jews, well, why not have the history of the evolution of Jews on the territory of Ukraine from the first time they were there until the present? See, then this becomes a question of emphasis, and then how you actually commemorate things. Standard, quote-unquote, old-fashioned museum? Or do we going to have more modern, interactive elements? And what did the, quote-unquote, international or Russian project do? They hired an extreme Russian filmmaker, a man named Krzyżanowski, who decided that he's going to make whatever is done at Babyn Yar so that people who go visit it can have a virtual experience of what it was like to be in Babyn Yar. And problematic here, very problematic. So this is not just international Ukrainian or Russian versus Ukrainian, it's what, and what should be emphasized or not emphasized.
And I imagine that if the Jewish community says that it should not be only the Babyn Yar and the Holocaust, but also the killing of Jews during a longer time also in Ukraine, then you have the pogroms and then you have the Ukrainians, yes, which are in the wardrobe right now, yeah. It's the same which discussion you have in Poland, yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I think, to be honest with you, when people would ask me, I think that the Poland Museum in Warsaw is the model, to be honest with you. I went to this exhibit and I came out of there of not only seeing the historical evolution of Jews on the territory of Poland, but I also got a sense of what Poland was and what the society as a whole was and how Jews fit into it. I mean, that would be my inclination to these things. But again, memorialization is problematic by definition. And it's totally on hold. Nothing's happening now.
And by definition, it is that this museum in Warsaw, it is not coming from above only, but it was also an initiative from below, and very smart people who worked for it his whole life. I want to change the theme now.
Okay.
Magocsi is famous for not only for he's famous of writing. The book, the big book about the Ukrainian history, has the title "It Lands and It Peoples," in many peoples. Yes, so he's famous for this. Is about writing about different people in Ukrainian lands. Yeah, he has written a book about Crimea and the Tatars in Crimea, about the people in Western Ukraine and Carpathia, and the Rusin or the Ruthenians.
And in Galicia.
Yes, and in Galicia. Yes. So if we begin with Crimea. The book is called The Blessed Land,
This Blessed Land.
Yeah. I mean, if you take all the lies of Putin, and put them 2 times worse, what is said about only Crimea, then he has never lied so much, and he says that it has always has been Russian territory, So what can you learn us about Crimea? Is Crimea Russian, Ukrainian, or only Crimea?
Simple answer is the third variant. Crimea is Crimea. And any particular territory, anywhere, has a complex history, various peoples, various influences. Crimea, in many ways, like Sicily or the Vojvodina, among the most ethno-linguistically and culturally complex entities, territorial entities on the European continent. The whole question of who it belongs to, well, Crimea is Crimea. If we look at the historical record, it's pretty easy to just do simple math. Crimea was only tangentially part of the realm of Kievan Rus. Only tangentially. And what does Russia have to do with Kievan Rus? Well, if you take the Russian perspective, well, this is the first Russian state, Kievan Russia, as it used to be known. Okay, that's a perspective, but is it a legitimate perspective? Well, you study the historical background, and we can have the same kind of discussion. Rus is Rus. It's not Russia or Ukraine. Rus is Rus. This is a total entity unto itself, quintessential medieval entity. So even Kievan Rus had only a tangential control, influence over Crimea. The vast majority of historical time, we have the presence of the Bosporan Kingdom, which was actually the first state, kind of serious state, or realistically kind of state, or proto-state on the territory of Ukraine. And part of it was in the eastern part of Crimea. But the first state structure that was really created exclusively on the territory of Crimea, and north of it was the Crimean Khanate, which came into being roughly in the 1430s.
And it had the part of the area to the Black Sea.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the whole northern part of northern part of the Sea of Azov and the eastern part of the Sea of Azov was part of the Khanate, without question. The Crimean Khanate being a very important element in the history of Ukraine. Anyone who knows about the history of Ukraine very often talks about the Polish-Lithuanian period. Well, It's actually not the Polish-Lithuanian period, it's the Lithuanian-Polish-Crimean period, because all three entities controlled most of the present-day territory of Ukraine, and the Crimean Tatars and the Crimean Khanate, an integral part of Ukrainian history. It is Ukrainian history. But so they created this Khanate in the 1430s, and it had lasted until 1783. Russia did not literally annex, or Crimea did not become part of Russia until 1783. So you had close to 350 years of the Crimean Khanate. And then if we take from 1783 until the Bolshevik Revolution, right? Well, that's about 150 years. All right, so people will say, well, then you have the Soviet period, which is also the Soviet Union is not Russia. But even if you threw that one in, still, Soviet Russia didn't control Crimea, or controlled it until 1954.
After the war,
until 1954. Precisely.
1860.
Yeah. So the point is that if we're just talking about simplistic historical precedent and age, and if one uses the argument, as states almost always do, the historical argument was who was there first or who was there the longest. Well, on that score, it's clear, without making much of an effort, that the Crimea, the best claim and the strongest claim to Crimea is the Crimean Khanate and the Crimean Tatar population. It's as simple as that. And all the rest is just how you interpret it. And if you interpret it in another way, if you have a state structure behind you to propagate that interpretation through the school system, and if you are a strong enough state, and therefore when you have other parts or other scholars in the world writing about your state, in this particular case, as we well know, that the Western interpretation of the history of Russia comes exclusively from historians writing in the second half of the 19th century, in particular Solovyov, Khrushchevsky, and the Soviets just added on to this. They're just an addendum. And from that perspective, Crimea was always a part of Russia. And since it was that Russian imperial, and then the Soviet variant of it, but certainly the Russian imperial, which set the tone for the first histories of Russia in the English language, by the way, that is how the West understood this part of the world. All of this part of the world was Russia, and it was always Russia.
Yeah. Read what Putin says and how he lies, yes, about that. But what they succeeded
I wouldn't use the verb lie. I would use the verb he was not mistaken.
Fantasizing.
But we'll think of another verb. I don't like to use lie, it's too strong. He was misled. That's it.
In other parts of Ukraine, in the western, you have the Carpathia, and then you have written a lot of the Ruthenians, the Ruthens, yes. You even have the biggest library of the Ruthens in the world, we have heard down here, yeah. Can you tell us something about these people and why they were special and what happened to them today and in the United States, perhaps? And how can you be interested? How it came that you began to be interested in these people who was in the Carpathia and Rus?
Well, first of all, let me preface it by saying, because you mentioned the history of Ukraine, what it's called, a history of Ukraine, the land and its peoples.
Yeah.
I always like to joke, and I think I may have even mentioned it in the preface to that book, that book is actually the first history of Ukraine. People say, what kind of pretentious person are you? Well, if we look at the tradition of Ukrainian historiography, And the big surveys, whether Hrushevsky, and I'm not talking about his 10 volumes, but rather his 1-volume histories, Hrushevsky, Doroshenko, Krypyakevich, several other lesser known, culminating with Sutelny. All of these are not histories of Ukraine. All of them are histories of the Ukrainian people, ethnic Ukrainians. That's what they are. And they do not discuss other elements in the population of Ukraine unless they impinge on their narrative, the history of Ukraine. So the Russians are the enemy, the Crimean Tatars are the enemy, certainly the Poles are the enemy, right? So these are histories of the Ukrainian people. Legitimate topic, but don't call them histories of Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine is a normal European country. It has a now clearly defined territory. And like every European country, even your country, Sweden, well, maybe not the Scanians, but there was this other group you told me about, the Lapps or the Sami. They're clearly a distinct people, right? So not everybody is. Sweden's also a multinational country. And I'm not talking about immigrants. The immigrants, it's a different, totally different story. We're talking about, quote unquote, indigenous, long-time populations. So every country in Europe has different peoples, and Ukraine is one of them. The problem with, and traditionally the problem with historiography throughout Europe is that it adopted the model of the Jacobins in the French Revolution, which interestingly preceded a period in which many national histories were starting to be written in the first half of the 19th century, in which the Jacobins, you know, everybody in France is, as they defined it, is French. You can only use the French language, and that all of these other groups, whether Alsatians or Occitans or Basques or Bretons, what? Those languages, those cultures are to be scorned. And if those languages are still used, I'm using Jacobin terms here, well, they're languages of the counter-revolution. Doesn't all this sound familiar? So the narrative is that one state, one people, one language. And in that context, we now have, and then we have historians buying into that approach. I have always been, you asked why I'm interested in these small peoples, I've always been interested in the losers. Because if you want to understand why the winners won, you have to know why the losers lost, quote unquote. And aside from the fact that I am also a child of Herder, totally a child of Herder, believing that every culture and every language is equal in the world. Kashubian is equal to Polish, thank you. And please, you Slavists, recognize Silesian as a distinct language and people who have a right to exist, even though the Supreme Court of Poland in a European liberal country has denied them that right. And so if you want to understand a society through a historical narrative, then you have to treat all of the peoples and cultures that ever existed on the territory of that state entity. And treat them as equal, not some of them as enemies or some of them as, you know, inferior or so forth and so on. They're all equal and they all have contributed to this society. And some of them still actually exist on the territory of Ukraine with their own entity. And in this context, we come to
Next question.
Kapitalisms, yes.
Because of all those peoples, anyhow, you have to make a state and a nation, citizen in the same state, yeah? Would you say that Ukraine, with all its people,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, yeah,
Yeah.
thanks to Putin, or at least during 30 years, has been more forced together to one Ukrainian nation than before in history?
Well, I think that's obvious. Here we're also talking about different kinds of identities. We are talking about, which is discussed, by the way, in this little pamphlet or handbook that was handed out, Ukraina Redux. There are two basic identities in any state. There are cultural identities, which are based on the ethno-linguistic background of a given population, which can be multifarious, as it is in most European countries. And then there's the civic identity that you garner from being a citizen. These are not necessarily the same. And so what we had in Ukrainian, in the history of Ukraine, or the territory of Ukraine, you had various peoples who bought into the particular power that was ruling them, but bought into that actively or passively. And we know that ever since the uprising of Zaporozhian Cossacks in 1648, the so-called Khmelnytsky uprising, and the eventual decision, voluntary decision, on the part of Khmelnytsky himself and his Cossack advisors to pledge allegiance to the Tsar of Muscovy, because they couldn't get into the Polish system. They wanted into some system, so they figured they might do better in the Muscovite system. Well, that was the first stage of eventual incorporation of most lands of present-day Ukraine into what then became the Russian Empire after 1721. We should only be talking about Russia after 1721. Russia doesn't exist until 1721. It's Muscovy before then.
And perhaps today also.
Well, no. Look, we cannot rename things that have been already existing, but the historical record is, right? So, so as a result of that, we had a significant population on the territory of Ukraine who were what we would call today ethnic Ukrainians, and who would call themselves Ukrainians or ethnic Ukrainians, but who were actively, in terms of the intelligentsia, certainly, and professional classes, and bureaucrats, of which there were numerous ones on the territory of Ukraine, locals who bought into an identification with Russia. First and foremost, adopting the Russian language, right? And that's the reason we have we still had, until recently, a very high number of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Only a certain portion of them were actually ethnic Russians. A very higher proportion were ethnic Ukrainians who used Russian. And when, after the war, after World War I, we have the creation of the Soviet Ukraine, so there was an actual entity. For most people, this was, you know, we live in now Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union, and yeah, fine, so we're living in the Ukrainian Republic as opposed to some other republic. So they had a passive relationship. Now, does this mean everyone? Of course not, but a very high number of people had that. And so it was very difficult to mobilize Ukrainians on behalf of a Ukrainian state. They got independence without a revolution in 1991, without a change not without a real political change, because most of the people who were running the country were still former Soviet apparatchiks. That's one thing. But there was certainly not a change in mindset for a high number of people living in southern and eastern Ukraine. That began to change with what one could call the first Ukrainian Revolution, and that was the Orange Revolution of 2004. And then, of course, came the Maidan, and that changed things even more. But you still had stragglers who were still not fully committed.
14, you mean?
Yeah, right. You still had stragglers. And then, of course, came 2022, and now we're in a totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Russophile orientation, if we want to call it that, it is now gone, and it is never going to come back. And it is thanks to one person.
Now maybe it's time for...
Oh yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. But to make that point,
blame it on him, not on me.
It put Ukraine on the world map for the first time in history, and the European map in the center. Yeah. We will leave the possibility to put questions to Mr. Professor. Yeah.
So Peter, you can moderate it.
Yeah. So, is there any? Yeah.
Hi, Lund University in Finland. In Canada, more than any other places, Ukrainian studies were the product of the efforts of the diaspora. And as far as I understand, it took several generations to sort of institutionalize it properly and to keep present as it is in Canadian universities. Now, with the sort of an awareness moment, tragic awareness moment for Ukraine as a topic of research, do you think it will be possible to sort of transplant that or start it again in Europe, you know, where, with the exception of Poland, you know, and Germany, you don't really have proper centers, you know, for Ukrainian research, or it's largely overshadowed by the strong preference to study all things Russian. And so far, it's not been changing very fast. What do you think is the ingredients that are necessary for that to happen?
First of all, just a point of fact, Canada is important, but the first center for Ukrainian studies, professional, was in the United States, not in Canada, in 1968, with the establishment of the Harvard program. First chair in history, a second chair in language, third chair in literature, and then an institute. So that was the first center. And then the second center came about 4 or 5 years later at the University of Alberta. Those are actually research centers. In the Harvard case, also endowed professoriates. There actually are no endowed, well, no, there are endowed professoriates, but not in history, but in ethnography at the University of Alberta, but not in history, and not in language for that matter, or in literature. Only in ethnography. But in the case of Canada, yes, then came not only that institute, then came the chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto endowed, then came an endowed chair in political science at the University of Ottawa. And so formal Ukrainian studies has increased and continues to receive support, funding, by the Ukrainian diaspora. And you're absolutely correct that both of these, the Harvard program almost exclusively with money from the Ukrainian diaspora, by the way, which turns out to have a $45 million endowment today. The Canadian programs, some of them were spearheaded by the diaspora, but many of them were supported through the diaspora by provincial governments or the federal government, because Ukrainians in Canada, unlike in the United States, have political influence, political clout. With regard to your question, however, is maybe with the exception of Poland and Germany just recently with the Vidrina Center. I don't know how active that is. There was an effort to do something in Flensburg, I seem to remember. But in general, your point, well taken. The Ukrainian studies in many places, including in prestigious places like the Institute, National Institute for Oriental Studies in Paris, are dominated still by a Russian perspective on Eastern Europe. My view is why that's the case and how to fix it. Well, my view is that, first and foremost, some of the most conservative social elements in society, despite the self-perception that they're on the cutting edge of everything, are academics. Very conservative. It's very difficult for them to change. If you're trained your whole life with thinking that in the Slavic world, the only thing that counts is Russian, because it's the biggest country, and the only thing that's worth studying are things that you know because you were told that you know, and that, you know, were translated, whether it's Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or whatever, into English or other foreign languages, and this is the only culture that counts. And so that has persisted. Certainly it's persisted in France, certainly it's persisted in Great Britain.
In Sweden.
And probably in Sweden. And so, how do you resolve this problem? Well, you wait for these people to die. That's it. And in the interim, you try to train other people to become sensitized to all the other cultures of Central and Eastern Europe, and not only Russian, because it's not only, you know, Ukrainians that suffer in this regard, but Serbs and Bulgarians, you know, we should know something about them too, by the way, let alone Poland, the great culture and civilization, of which we know a little bit, but still don't have the kind of respect that Poland requires or deserves. And so you have to wait for that generation to go away, and in the interim, to train enough people in Ukrainian matters and be able to then create positions. And again, it didn't look so good until 2022, or even to the Orange Revolution. It was the Orange Revolution that started to change people's thoughts in North America. Suddenly, Ukraine exists. And had this very attractive prime minister. I mean, you know, it all looked good, right? These moments are very important. And as a result of that, and certainly as a result of the war, absolutely correct, Ukraine has never been known, and now it's known. I mean, like, super known. One would say, unfortunately, and very unfortunately, for the wrong reasons, but there has been a silver lining in this. And that silver lining is an understanding at the most minimal level that Ukrainians exist as a people. They have their own Olympic teams with their own flags. They have their own football teams. You know, this is where it counts in terms of getting a message across to the outside world. And the present events have done nothing but to emphasize that. And at least in North America, there is now demand for people to teach Ukrainian language, literature, and history. Now, in Europe, they're slower. But Europe's slower anyway. So that's how I would respond. Don't go out and assassinate these older people. Let them be. Let them slowly
some of them
fade
are
away.
changing their minds.
Well, and okay, and maybe even that could happen.
Yeah, it can happen. To give you an example of what Putin has made about Ukraine and the famous of Ukraine all over the world today, I showed when traveling on the train with Mr. Professor in which libraries his books can be found in Sweden. Yeah, I tell you, when I wrote my book about Ukrainian history more than 10 years ago, I had to buy all the books because there was no library in Sweden which had it. Yes, even the university libraries. Yeah. So I ended up with having the biggest single Ukrainian library in Sweden, yes. But today it is not like that, because during those 3, 4, 5 years, the university libraries and other has begun to buy in literature about Ukraine. Yeah. So the books of Professor Magocsi you can find in several tens of libraries in Sweden today. Yeah. Something positive which came out of this war again, yeah. Thomas, yeah, I pass you, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for an interesting discussion. I'm Jens, I'm a master's student of European Studies and History, and I would like to hear you reflect a bit on two trends that perhaps have been accelerated by the Russian war. The first being the path to EU accession for Ukraine, and the second being the rehabilitation of figures such as Stefan Bandera. And previously, dealing with the history or dealing with the past has been a formal and informal criteria for entry into the European Union, and instrumentalized as a way of promoting democratization through the Union or through new member countries. And do you see any risk of that this might be overlooked in the Ukrainian case? And do you see any risk of undigested histories being uploaded into a European memory frame? Or do you think it could perhaps slow the Ukrainian ascension process in a way?
First of all, what did you mean by what might be overlooked? What were you referring to in the overlooked?
I was referring to the process or the perhaps the formal or semi-formal demand to deal with problematic histories.
Yeah, and I guess you're referring to at least the first one that comes to mind, the Volhynia matter of 1943 with Poland, or some statements by politicians. And remember, they're statements by politicians, and they're political statements. So, look, as a result of this war, we all know that Ukraine now exists, that the perception of the vast majority of present-day European leaders now seem to not even question, but Ukraine is part of Europe from their mind. And that, to my mind, is the most important achievement. The timeline or the timetable for Ukraine, which is a country at war, to enter European institutions such as NATO and the European Union, is difficult to gauge. But one could not even be seriously contemplating it until you had a change in the mindset, again, of a significant number of the political elite in the continent, and also the media elite, intellectual elite, that Ukraine is part of Europe. That, to my mind, was the most important thing that needed to be achieved, and it has been achieved. Again, the timelines, what do I know or what do you know in terms of when this accession process will take place, whether it's NATO or the European Union. Quite frankly, at one level, I find it even strange that the European Union, quote unquote, has gone so far to talk about accession talks for Ukraine at a time when it's in war. Stop and think about it. In a normal war, why would one want to accept a country into the Union that's already at war? Right? So that's That's somewhat extraordinary, actually. Now with regard to historical memory and the use of history for political purposes. Always the case. That's one of the main values of history. For states and politicians to justify their existences and their policies. And I don't know, I guess I would say there was hungry before Orban and there will be hungry after Orban. What seems to be issues of concern at a particular moment and issues of concern that are expressed by political leaders for many of the reasons that's quite easy to understand. I don't consider them, and I don't think that these are major obstacles. They're unpleasant, you got to be reminded of them, and so forth and so on. But I would say that the Polish concern as expressed so starkly regarding we have to straighten out the understanding of Volhynia in 1943, and of course straightening out the understanding of Volhynia in 1943 is that these dastardly Ukrainians led by the UPA and their allies, killed tens and tens of thousands of Poles. And so what? Now, what is one supposed to do? Get down on your knees and, plead with the Poles to forgive? What's supposed to be the result of it? Namely, the whole matter of putting it on a political agenda is a purely political act. And I don't see that as being an ultimate deterrent to the political process of Ukraine, not only already in being in Europe and perceived as European, but then becoming part of European institutions.
I think I can add here, In my library, I think I have 10 books, with the same name, the same color, the same layout in the framework, the same title, Polska, Ukraina, trudna sprawa. Poland, Ukraina, difficult question, difficult matter. All those books are stenograms of different historical conferences during the last 15-20 years, And whatever will happen, and when Ukraine comes into the European Union, this will be discussed by historians and sold by historians what happened, I mean, during 40 years in Poland, I have seen how many questions in a free country during those years are openly discussed, and then there is no matter, And this will in the future for sure happen both with Volhynia, where the Poles also killed the Ukrainians, although not so many, but the number doesn't. They killed them in the same way.
Right, they killed them in the same way.
And we have the relations that they did in the same way, the same barbaric way. The same is with Stefan Bandera and what UPA did with the Jews or other programs in Ukrainian history. I mean, you will have the same discussion by historians in Ukraine as you have had in so many other countries before when it goes further. I mean, you have it still in Poland today, to find the dead bodies or the unpleasant things in the wardrobe, Actually, 2 months ago was published a book about pogroms in Krakow after the Second World War, No one had known it before. This is a process which comes to Ukraine also. And it has nothing to do, well, it has to do because it will make it easy in a democratic country to discuss it, But it has nothing to do with the formal membership of the European Union or NATO.
And by the way, they're all...
you agree? Or?
I fully agree. It's that I thought I was more or less saying the same thing. Absolutely. There is also, on these particular issues, there is a model of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's between the French and Germans after World War II. I mean, you want a story of conflict and much more than 1 year. And yet, they worked it out somehow. And they created a young generation which has no clue and couldn't care less about so-called French-German hatred. And certainly wouldn't give a second thought to care where Alsace and Lorraine is.
And that is the same today between Poland and Ukraine. The worst people in Poland are those who are going to create hate in this question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's Kaczynski and so on. Yeah. So
The gentleman over there had a...
Yeah. Yes, you were here.
Yeah. Speaking of that matter and the comment that you made about Alida Asma's work on memory of the Holocaust and its role as
and
a
the
European
European
project.
identity or European memory.
I'm thinking, and sorry.
Yeah, but she said European. I mean, I was referring to her. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was on that because she's placed the Holocaust in a central place in the discourse, a way to deal with difficult questions and European memory and whatnot. So what, and I fully aware of this, you know, that only 1976 they put up a memorial that mentioned the Jewish plight at one monument at all at Babyn Yar, and they only became mentioning the Jews in 1983 and whatnot. But what about this other revisionist that goes on today? Is a monument built to the organization of Ukrainian nationalists at Babyn Yar. There's a memorial to Olena Teliha, who was Dontsov's mistress and whose husband edited Ukrainske Slovo, which applauded the removal of the Jews. And is linked to a number of 621, specifically all Knights killed there. And he claimed that Olena Teliha was killed there, of which there are no evidence, of course. But what to make of that? Isn't that part of this sort of like, if Alida Eisman's idea is to conceptualize European history and problematize this, if you have a revisionist aspect of this, so say here, you're raising a monument also to, we know that Ukrainske Kuren, or most likely, was Berkov and Nachmanovich and Berkov and Burakovsky writes about this, how they...
But not Nachmanovich. Denies
he denies it. Sorry, I got it wrong. But also Burakovsky and Karel Berkov and Yura Radchenko. There, and the evidence, if you look at the interrogations of these people in the Schutzmannschaften, that it seems very likely that they took part in the shooting. So you have here a member of the organization that took part in the extermination being honored at the place of the massacre of Jews. How is this? How should we make sense of this? And are there ways around this and addressing this and coming to terms with this? Because this is sort of like an issue that really is harming Ukraine, for lack of other, if not on historical understanding.
How to make sense of it, I guess, and then how to get around it. I guess my observations would be the following. How to make sense of it, I think it's pretty straightforward. Everybody wants to have a voice as an individual in society. And if they feel committed to the particular group to which they belong, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an ethnic group or linguistic group, it could be a political party, it could have, it could be some kind of organization, wants to have their voice and their view present in the narrative about the country in which they live. One of the problems with Babyn Yar and commemoration at Babyn Yar is that there is total anarchy and chaos. People and institutions just came and put up monuments. Literally. I mean, the Roma put up monument, and then someone took it down, and they put it up again. The Orthodox Church built a little chapel, which is still there, because allegedly one priest or some other one was killed. the Kaleha monument, which is quite diminutive, I might say, but nonetheless, yeah.
But she has a street named, yeah?
Yeah, well, the street runs through there, fine. Not fine, but it does, that's fact. But these are inevitable. On the one hand, they're a reflection of some needs in a society, or the needs of some elements in society, that their story somehow be told. Now, it is absolutely true that sometimes their story is going to either be, or their understanding of their story is either going to be denied or totally opposed by other elements in the society. Now, in the case specifically of Babyn Yar, with this chaotic number of monuments, how, as you asked, how to get around that? Well, this would be gotten around, would have to be gotten around, when, if ever, the place is properly memorialized by a conceptual plan in which government and civic institutions in Ukraine, representing Ukraine, carry this out. It's at that moment that some order is going to have to be put in to what is now disorder, in which anyone can get their voice there if they have enough support, because no one's going to block it. So that would be a way to get around this. The whole question of the participation of UPA, which first of all didn't exist in 1941, by the way. Interesting, but let's get at least one historical fact here.
I said
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, all right, the Organization of Ukrainian... No, but UPA, pardon, UPA was also mentioned, I don't know if by you or by somebody else, so whatever. All of these issues are historical controversies which are not going to ever be overcome in a simplistic way. Can never be an either-or situation. I mean, let's face reality. Because there are elements in the population that are, you know, feel that their voice and their understanding of their past has legitimacy and needs to be heard. So that's how I would answer the question.